Did you ever have to raise a baby bird, a tiny little baby bird? Hello and welcome. Welcome to Input English. Today's story is a true story from my childhood. I'm going to tell you about what happened when a storm came through and knocked a bunch of limbs out of the trees, including one holding up a bird's nest. So after the storm blew through, someone in the family was outside and noticed that the tree limb that had fallen near the house contained a bird's nest, and it didn't have anything in it. But they quickly discovered that near that bird's nest there were two baby birds, and they were alive. They were very young and their nest was destroyed. So my parents had a decision to make. What are they going to do about these birds? The birds were so young that if they left them in the yard, a cat or some other animal would just scoop them up and they would quickly perish. So my parents decided to save them. So they were put in a small cardboard box, and they contacted the veterinarian to ask for guidance. They made some recommendations, and we got an eyedropper to feed these birds, and they also bought some worms at the hardware store, worms that ordinarily would be used for fish bait, for fishing. These were live worms, and they broke the worms up into little pieces and fed them to the birds. Now these little birds had a very big mouth, and so they would open their mouth and they seemed to be all mouth. And they were very quick to get a hold of anything that looked like food. So we learned that if you took some mashed up bits of worm and put it on the end of your finger, you could present that to the baby bird and the bird would take the worm away. Later, they substituted canned dog food for this food for these little birds. And between the eyedropper with water and the food on the end of the finger, these birds survived. We kept them in a cardboard box. They had something on the bottom, I don't know what, to absorb waste and keep them clean. And the birds grew. They grew very quickly, and their feathers grew. And initially they would just hop around or walk around. Later their wings developed feathers and they would flap their little wings. We continued feeding them. Of course, they got very used to being handled by the kids, and so they were used to us, we were used to them. As their feathers came in, my mom, who was very knowledgeable about birds, explained that these two birds were brown thrashers. That was the species of bird that we had rescued, two brown thrasher chicks. The birds continued to grow, and then they started to fly, and they flew around inside the house. And since they were used to us, they would perch on our finger, they would perch on our shoulder, they would perch on our head, and they would come to us. We fed them, and we got along fine. My parents realized that there was a fundamental problem here, and that is these birds are wild birds. And even though we enjoyed raising them and preventing them from being killed as young baby birds, my parents decided they needed to be turned loose. They needed to be wild birds in the wild. These were not birds that should be kept long-term as pets. These facts were presented to the kids. They said, you know, we had a responsibility to save these birds, but that doesn't give us the right to keep them as a pet. These are wild animals. and they need to be free, not kept in a cage. So at some point, the parents made the decision that it was time to set the birds free, and so they were turned loose in the morning, and they stuck pretty close to the house for a few days, and eventually they disappeared. It was an interesting experience interacting with a wild animal, and I agree with the way my parents handled that. As the problem unfolded, they felt they had a duty to save these little birds from certain death if they did nothing. But at the same time, they did not get the right to turn these wild animals into domestic pets. So I think they did a really good job. And of course, the kids got to interact with these birds as they were growing up, and we got to watch their milestones as they developed skills. It was an interesting experience as a kid to be in the house and have a bird take off, fly around the room, and land on my shoulder. That was interesting, but it was normal in our household for a short period of time. So that's the end of this very short episode. Hope you enjoyed it. I invite comments below and hope you join us in future videos. See you soon.